Alice Winters was 32 years old when she was thrown from a moving wagon like unwanted cargo. The Dakota Territory stretched wide and unforgiving in the summer of 1876, a land where the sun blazed without mercy and the wind carried secrets across endless plains. Fort Laramie stood as a weathered sentinel on the edge of civilization, a collection of timber buildings and dirt roads where soldiers, traders, and dreamers converged. The fort had seen decades of conflict and peace, treaties made and broken, and the constant flow of people seeking fortune or escape in the untamed West. On this particular afternoon, the stagecoach rumbled to a halt outside the trading post, dust swirling in thick clouds as horses stamped and snorted their relief. Alice stepped down carefully, her navy blue traveling dress already coated in a fine layer of prairie dust that had worked its way into every fiber. Her gloves were grey with it, her bonnet askew, the ribbon meant to hold it in place, hanging loose. But she held her carpetbag with steady hands and her chin lifted high, refusing to show the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones. She had travelled 3 weeks from Boston, enduring cramped coaches that smelled of unwashed bodies, questionable lodgings where she'd slept sitting upright, and the constant gnawing fear that she had made a terrible mistake. But she was here now, and there was no turning back. The letter had been clear, almost poetic in its promises. Mr. Vernon Caldwell, a prosperous cattle rancher seeking a wife of good character and reasonable age, willing to build a life in the untamed West. He had written of his ranch, of the vast grasslands and clear streams, of a house with real glass windows. Alice had written back with complete honesty, stating her age plainly at 32, her education at Miss Pemberton's Academy, her skills in managing a household after 7 years running a successful boarding house in Boston. His response had been warm, even eager, assuring her that age mattered far less than compatibility and strength of character. She had allowed herself to hope, to dream of a new beginning, far from Boston's suffocating propriety and the pitying looks of neighbors who whispered about the spinster who'd let her chances slip away. Now, standing in the dusty street with the sun beating down on her shoulders and sweat trickling beneath her corset, she searched the sparse crowd for a man matching the description in his letters. Tall, fair-haired, in his mid-40s, likely wearing a black hat and riding boots, with kind eyes. Instead, her eyes found a woman, sharp-featured and coldly elegant, dressed in expensive green silk that seemed absurdly out of place in this rough frontier town. The dress was immaculate, with intricate embroidery along the bodice that must have cost more than Alice's entire year's earnings. The woman approached with measured steps, her eyes scanning Alice from head to toe with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating livestock at market. Behind her walked a young man, barely 20, with soft hands that had clearly never seen hard labor and a weak chin that receded into a fleshy neck. Beside him came a younger woman who looked bored and irritated in equal measure, fanning herself dramatically. "Miss Winters," the older woman said, not as a question but as a statement of fact delivered with crisp authority. Her voice carried across the street, drawing attention from nearby merchants. Alice nodded, setting down her bag and straightening her shoulders despite the ache. "Yes, I'm Alice Winters. I'm here to meet Mr. Caldwell. I trust your journey from the ranch wasn't too difficult." "I am Mrs. Caldwell," the woman interrupted, as if Alice's pleasantries were an insult to her time. "Vernon's mother. This is my son and my daughter Constance. I manage all household affairs, including the selection of appropriate brides." Alice's stomach tightened with the first whisper of unease. The letters had never mentioned a mother, never hinted at anyone else being involved in this arrangement. She extended her hand politely, forcing a warm smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Caldwell. Your son's letters were most thoughtful and kind. How old are you?" Mrs. Caldwell cut through her words like a knife through butter, ignoring the extended hand completely. Alice hesitated, confused by the abruptness and the coldness in the woman's pale blue eyes. "I'm 32, ma'am. As I stated clearly in my very first correspondence with your son, he assured me that my age was perfectly acceptable. Mrs. Caldwell's expression hardened into something resembling disgust, her lips pressing into a thin line. She turned to her son without breaking eye contact with Alice. "Vernon, you assured me she was young. You said she was suitable for bearing children and managing a ranch household for decades to come." Vernon Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting everywhere except toward Alice, his face flushing red. "Mother, she seemed... In her letters she appeared... She's past her prime," Mrs. Caldwell declared loudly enough that several passers-by turned to look, their conversations dying mid-sentence. A few even stopped walking, sensing drama. "Look at her. Lines around the eyes, hands that have seen work, rough and reddened. This is not a woman who can bear strong sons without risk. This is not what we agreed upon." Heat flooded Alice's cheeks, burning with humiliation as she felt the weight of multiple eyes upon her. But she kept her voice steady, drawing on every ounce of dignity she possessed. "Mrs. Caldwell, I assure you I'm in excellent health. I've never been seriously ill. I've run a boarding house for 7 years, managing 12 rooms, cooking for up to 20 guests, handling all the accounts. I'm capable, educated, and more than willing to learn whatever specific skills ranch life requires." "Too old," the woman repeated, as if Alice hadn't spoken at all. "We cannot accept this arrangement. Vernon requires a young bride, someone barely 20, someone who can give him children without risk, someone whose body hasn't been worn down by years of labor." Alice looked directly at Vernon, waiting for him to speak, to defend her, to honor the promises made in those carefully written letters that she'd read until she'd memorized every word. But he only stared at his boots, a red flush creeping up his neck, his hands fidgeting with his belt buckle. "Mr. Caldwell," Alice said directly, forcing steel into her voice, making him look up. "You knew my age from the very beginning. I was honest in every letter. You said it didn't matter. You said you valued character and strength over youth. You said you'd had enough of silly young girls who couldn't handle frontier life. Those were your exact words. My son was being foolish and sentimental," Mrs. Caldwell snapped, stepping between them as if physically blocking their connection. "Men often are when left to their own devices. The reality is different from romantic notions. We cannot use you. The wagon leaves in 10 minutes for our ranch. You will not be on it. Consider the arrangement terminated." The words struck Alice like physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision. Around them a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. "Imagine traveling all this way just to be turned away," someone murmured with false sympathy. "Poor thing, too old, they say, what a shame," another voice added. "Should have known better at her age," a third person chimed in. Alice felt the world tilting slightly, the exhaustion of 3 weeks' travel suddenly crushing down on her shoulders. Her vision blurred at the edges. She had sold everything. Her boarding house, her furniture, her mother's china that had been in the family for 3 generations. She had burned every bridge to come here, believing in promises written in careful script, believing that somewhere in this vast territory there was a place for her. A purpose, a future. "Mrs. Caldwell," she tried once more, hating the tremor in her voice. "Please, I've come so far. Surely we can discuss this reasonably. Perhaps if I could just speak with your son privately." "There is nothing to discuss," the woman said, with crushing finality, dismissing Alice's plea with a wave of her gloved hand. She gestured sharply to her son. "Vernon, get in the wagon. We've wasted enough time on this unfortunate situation. Constance, come along!" They turned away as if Alice had simply ceased to exist, as if she were no more substantial than the dust swirling around their feet. The wagon, already loaded with supplies and crates, sat waiting in front of the trading post. Vernon climbed aboard without a backward glance, settling onto the bench with his shoulders hunched. Constance followed, arranging her skirts with deliberate care. Alice stood frozen, her carpet bag at her feet, watching them prepare to leave. The crowd's whispers grew louder, more pitying. She felt stripped bare, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with dignity. Her hands trembled, and she clasped them together tightly. Mrs. Caldwell was about to climb aboard when she paused, turned back, and called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "A word of advice, Miss Winters. Women of a certain age should know their place. The frontier is for the young and strong, not for those whose best years are behind them. You'd do well to return east and find employment as a companion to an elderly woman. That's where women like you belong." Then she hauled herself onto the wagon bench with surprising agility for someone so concerned with youth, settling her silk skirts around her with satisfaction. The driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth and a weather-beaten face, cracked his whip above the horses' heads. The animals lurched forward, and the wagon began to roll, wheels crunching over the packed earth. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, Alice would struggle to piece together the exact sequence of events. As the wagon picked up speed, passing directly by where Alice stood rooted to the spot, Mrs. Caldwell leaned out slightly over the side, her face twisted with contempt. "Find your own way back east. Old woman," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Perhaps this will teach you not to reach above your station." But the wagon hit a deep rut in the road at that exact moment, one of the many potholes that plagued Fort Laramie's poorly maintained streets. The jolt was violent, sudden, the entire wagon frame jerking sideways. Mrs. Caldwell, leaning too far out and not holding on securely in her moment of triumphant cruelty, lost her balance completely. She shrieked, a high-pitched sound of genuine terror. As she tumbled backward out of the wagon, her green silk skirts billowing around her, Alice reacted on pure instinct, without thought for her own safety or the woman's treatment of her. She lunged forward, arms outstretched, trying to break the fall, trying to prevent serious injury. For a brief second their hands met, Alice's fingers closing around Mrs. Caldwell's wrist. Then Mrs. Caldwell, in panic or perhaps deliberate malice, yanked hard on Alice's arm with surprising strength. The force pulled Alice completely off balance. She stumbled forward, her feet tangling in her own skirts. "She pushed me!" Mrs. Caldwell screamed as she hit the ground with a heavy thud that knocked the air from her lungs. "The crazy woman pushed me! She tried to kill me!" Alice fell hard a second later, her shoulder striking the packed earth with brutal force, pain shooting through her arm and radiating across her back. She lay there, stunned, dust in her mouth coating her tongue, her ears ringing from the impact. The wagon had stopped abruptly. Vernon and Constance were climbing down in a panic, rushing toward their mother. A crowd swarmed around them immediately. Voices shouted, overlapping in confusion. "I saw it. The old woman pushed her." "I know, she was trying to help." Mrs. Caldwell fell on her own. "That bride tried to kill her." Alice pushed herself up on trembling arms, her head spinning. Mrs. Caldwell was sitting up now, held by her son, her face red with rage and humiliation. The woman's eyes locked onto Alice with pure venom. "Assault!" Mrs. Caldwell hissed through clenched teeth. "She assaulted me. She deliberately pushed me from a moving wagon. Someone fetch the sheriff immediately." "No!" Alice gasped, finding her voice, though it came out weak. She struggled to her knees, then to her feet, swaying. "No, that's not what happened. I was trying to catch you. You fell. I tried to help." "Liar!" Constance shouted shrilly, pointing an accusing finger. "We all saw you push Mother. You were angry about being rejected." The crowd was turning ugly, the mood shifting like a storm gathering. Alice could feel it in the air, the way people who moments ago had pitied her now looked at her with suspicion and anger. She struggled to stand fully upright, her legs shaking. "I didn't," she said desperately, her voice rising. She looked around at the faces surrounding her. "Please, you must believe me, I would never hurt anyone. I was trying to help." But Mrs. Caldwell was playing her part perfectly, moaning and clutching her side as if gravely injured. Vernon supported her with exaggerated concern. "She's dangerous," someone in the crowd muttered. "Unhinged," another agreed. "Crazy old spinster." Alice felt panic rising in her throat. This couldn't be happening. In the span of mere minutes, she had gone from rejected bride to accused criminal. Her carpet bag still lay in the street, partially buried in dust. A rough hand grabbed her arm, fingers digging in painfully. She turned with a gasp to find a large man with a deputy's badge scowling at her. "You're coming with me until we sort this out," he growled, his breath reeking of whiskey. "No, please." "I didn't do anything," Alice protested, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. "Please, you have to listen." That's when the second wagon appeared. It rolled into the chaotic scene with an almost eerie calm, moving at a measured pace. The wagon was pulled by two sturdy paint horses, their coats gleaming with health. The driver sat tall and utterly still, surveying the commotion with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He was Lakota. That much was immediately clear from his features, from the strong planes of his face, his long black hair worn loose over his shoulders, and the traditional beadwork visible on his leather vest. But he wore it mixed with frontier clothing, denim pants, and worn boots. Tahoma Blackhorse had come to Fort Laramie to trade furs and purchase supplies for the coming winter. He made this journey 4 times a year, one of the few from his band who still engaged regularly with the white man's world. He had watched the entire scene unfold from his position down the street where he'd been loading supplies, and what he had witnessed did not match the accusations being hurled. He guided his wagon forward slowly, deliberately, until it stood between Alice and the growing mob. Then he climbed down with fluid grace, his movements unhurried despite the tension crackling in the air. He was tall, lean, but powerfully built. "I saw what happened," he said clearly, his English perfect but accented with the rhythms of his first language. The deputy paused, his hand still gripping Alice's arm. "This ain't your concern, Indian," he said dismissively. Tahoma's eyes, dark as river stones, didn't waver. "I was standing there. I saw everything." The woman did not push. The old one in the green dress fell when the wagon hit the rut. "This woman tried to catch her." Mrs. Caldwell's face purpled with outrage. "How dare you? Vernon, are you going to let this savage call me a liar?" "No, puss." But several other voices were rising now, people who had actually been positioned to see clearly. "He's right," an old prospector called out from the porch of the trading post. "I seen it too, clear as day. The lady in green fell on her own. This gal was trying to help. The Indian speaks true," a young soldier added, stepping forward. "I was standing right there by the water trough. Mrs. Caldwell lost her balance when the wagon hit that rut." A middle-aged woman in faded calico nodded vigorously. "That's exactly what I saw. The poor dear was trying to help." The deputy's grip on Alice loosened slightly as he looked around, calculating. Mrs. Caldwell, sensing her story was crumbling, quickly changed tactics. She allowed Vernon to help her to her feet, brushing dust from her ruined dress with sharp movements. "Fine," she said coldly. "Perhaps I was mistaken about the push, but that changes absolutely nothing about the original matter. This woman is not welcome at our ranch. She is not suitable, and she is no longer our responsibility in any way." She climbed back into the wagon with as much dignity as she could muster, though her elaborate hairstyle hung in disarray. Vernon followed like an obedient dog. Constance shot Alice one final look of contempt before joining them. The wagon rolled away for the second time, leaving Alice standing in the middle of the street, shaking with adrenaline and shock. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, exposing her chemise. Dust and dirt covered her from head to toe. The crowd began to disperse quickly, the excitement over. The deputy released her arm and walked away without a word. Within moments, Alice was alone again, except for the Lakota man who had spoken in her defense. Tahoma Blackhorse stood a respectful distance away, his dark eyes studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity exactly, something more like recognition. Alice became acutely aware of how she must look, disheveled beyond repair, desperate and alone, a woman publicly rejected and nearly arrested. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice rough and scraped raw. She cleared her throat, tried again. "Thank you for speaking the truth. You didn't have to do that. You could have stayed silent." Tahoma inclined his head slightly. "Truth is truth," he said simply, his voice deep and calm. "It does not need permission to be spoken." Alice bent to retrieve her carpetbag, wincing as her bruised shoulder protested. When she straightened, she found Tahoma still watching her, his expression thoughtful. "You have nowhere to go," he said after a long moment. It wasn't a question. Alice's throat tightened. She looked around the street. "I'll manage," she said, trying to sound confident. "There must be a boarding house, or I can work for passage back east." "The boarding house is full," Tahoma said quietly. "Soldiers came through yesterday, took all the rooms, and the next stage east doesn't leave for 2 weeks." The information hit Alice like cold water. 2 weeks. She had perhaps enough money for a few nights, but not 2 weeks' worth. And what then? Even if she made it back to Boston, she had nothing to return to. She must have swayed slightly, because suddenly Tahoma was there, his hand steadying her elbow. His touch was gentle but firm, and Alice found herself looking up into a face marked by sun and wind, with strong features and eyes that held depth she couldn't fathom. "My camp is an hour's ride north," he said at last, his voice low. "By the Laramie River. I have supplies to gather here, then I return before sunset. You could come, rest for a few days. Decide what you will do next." Alice stared at him, trying to process the offer. A stranger, a Lakota man offering her shelter when her own people had thrown her away. It should have frightened her. Everything in her Boston upbringing screamed warnings. But all she could think was that this man had stood up for her when no one else would. He had told the truth when lies would have been easier. "Why?" she asked simply. Tahoma was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have seen many things thrown away in my life. Horses that could not work fast enough. Dogs that grew too old. People who did not fit into the boxes others made for them. It is wrong. Life is sacred, all life." Something in Alice's chest loosened just a fraction. She looked around at the street one more time, at the town that had witnessed her humiliation, at the empty road where the Caldwell wagon had disappeared. Then she looked back at Tahoma Blackhorse, at his patient stance and steady gaze. "All right," she heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I accept your kindness." The ride north from Fort Laramie began in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves against hard-packed earth and the creak of wagon wheels turning through prairie grass. Alice sat beside Tahoma on the wooden bench, her carpetbag clutched in her lap like a shield, her body rigid with uncertainty and exhaustion. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, relentless and unforgiving, turning the vast Dakota landscape into a shimmering expanse of gold and amber. In the distance, the Black Hills rose like dark sentinels against the horizon, their peaks crowned with pine forests that seemed to promise coolness and shade. Tahoma guided the horses with practiced ease, his hands loose on the reins. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested complete comfort with solitude and open spaces. He didn't attempt conversation, didn't fill the silence with meaningless pleasantries or questions Alice wasn't ready to answer. For that she was grateful. Her mind still reeled from the events at Fort Laramie, replaying the humiliation in an endless loop. Mrs. Caldwell's cold assessment, Vernon's cowardice, the crowd's whispers, the accusation of assault. Each memory struck like a fresh blow. She glanced sideways at Tahoma, studying his profile when she thought he wouldn't notice. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. A thin scar ran along his left temple, disappearing into his hairline. His hair, black as a raven's wing, hung loose past his shoulders, occasionally lifted by the breeze. He wore a mix of traditional and frontier clothing, with unself-conscious ease. The beaded vest over a simple cotton shirt, leather leggings, and worn boots that had seen countless miles. At his hip hung a knife in a decorated sheath, and a rifle rested within easy reach behind the seat. Alice wondered what he must think of her. A foolish white woman who had traveled across a continent to marry a stranger, only to be rejected like damaged goods. She felt shame burning in her chest, hot and bitter. What kind of desperation drove a woman to such lengths? And yet, sitting beside this quiet stranger who had defended her without hesitation, she felt something else too. Not quite hope, but perhaps the absence of complete hopelessness. They crossed a shallow creek, the horses picking their way carefully over smooth stones worn round by centuries of water. The sound was musical, peaceful. On the far bank, a cluster of cottonwood trees offered brief shade, and Tahoma slowed the wagon to a stop beneath their branches. "The horses need water," he said, climbing down. It was the first either of them had spoken since leaving the fort. Alice nodded, watching as he led the animals to the creek's edge. They drank deeply, their muzzles breaking the water's surface with contented snorts. She climbed down from the wagon more carefully, her bruised shoulder protesting the movement. Her legs felt unsteady after the long ride, and she leaned against the wagon wheel for support. Tahoma returned with a canteen he'd filled from the creek. He offered it to Alice without a word. She hesitated, then took it, drinking gratefully. The water was cold and clean, tasting faintly of minerals and earth. It soothed her parched throat. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. He nodded, taking a drink himself before securing the canteen to the wagon. Then he reached into a canvas bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal strips of dried meat and a piece of cornbread. He broke the cornbread in half and offered her a portion along with some of the meat. "You should eat," he said simply. Alice realized she hadn't eaten since early morning, before the stagecoach had arrived at Fort Laramie. Her stomach growled at the sight of food. She accepted it, trying not to appear too eager. The cornbread was dense and slightly sweet, the dried meat tough but flavorful with salt and smoke. They ate, standing in the shade, the only sounds the horses' occasional snorts and the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves. "How far is your camp?" Alice asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Another hour, perhaps less," Tahoma replied. He gestured toward the north. "Beyond those hills, near the river where the water runs clear and the fishing is good." Alice followed his gesture, seeing only endless prairie rolling toward distant hills. She couldn't imagine what lay beyond, couldn't picture where she was going or what she would find there. The uncertainty should have terrified her, but somehow it didn't. Perhaps because she had already lost everything that mattered, there was nothing left to fear. "Do you live alone?" she asked, then immediately worried the question was too personal, too presumptuous. Tahoma was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes distant. "Yes," he said finally. "Once I lived with my band, but things changed. Treaties were broken. Land was taken. Many were forced onto reservations. I chose a different path." There was pain in those simple words, an entire history compressed into a few sentences. Alice wanted to ask more, to understand, but she sensed this wasn't the time. Some stories required trust before they could be told. "I'm sorry," she said instead, meaning it. Tahoma looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "We all carry losses," he said quietly. "The question is what we do with them. Whether we let them destroy us or whether we find a way to keep living." The words settled into Alice's chest, heavy with truth. She thought of Sam, the fiancé who had marched off to war and never returned. She thought of the years she'd spent waiting, the years after, when she'd tried to build a life from the ruins of her dreams. She thought of the letters from Vernon Caldwell, the hope they'd kindled, and the ashes of that hope now scattered in a dusty street. "I don't know how to keep living," she admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Tahoma finished his water, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You don't have to know," he said. "You just have to take the next step, and then the next one after that. Eventually, you'll find yourself somewhere you didn't expect to be. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something. A kind of rough wisdom born from experience." Alice found herself nodding, accepting his words, even though she didn't fully believe them yet. They climbed back onto the wagon, and Tahoma guided the horses back onto the trail. The afternoon wore on, the sun tracking slowly across the endless sky. Alice watched the landscape change as they traveled, the prairie grass giving way to rockier terrain, low hills rising around them. She saw antelope in the distance, their white rumps flashing as they bounded away. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace. "It's beautiful," Alice said, surprised by her own observation. She'd been so focused on her misery, she hadn't really looked at where she was. But it was beautiful, in a wild, untamed way that bore no resemblance to Boston's manicured parks and orderly streets. Yes, Tahoma agreed. This land has its own spirit. You have to learn to listen to it, to move with it instead of against it. The white men who come here often try to force the land to be what they want. It doesn't work. The land always wins. Alice thought about the Caldwells and their ranch, about Vernon's letters describing how he was taming the wilderness, building civilization in the savage territory. She wondered if Tahoma was right, if the land would ultimately resist such efforts. She wondered if that was why so many settlers failed, why so many dreams died in this unforgiving place. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they crested a hill, and Alice saw the river below, a ribbon of silver winding through a valley dotted with trees. Tahoma's camp sat on a bend in the river, sheltered by a stand of willows. There was a small cabin, more of a dugout really, built partially into the hillside with a sod roof. Beside it stood a corral with several horses, and a lean-to that served as storage. Smoke rose from a fire pit near the cabin, suggesting someone had been there recently. As they descended the hill, a dog emerged from the cabin, a large mixed breed with wolf-like features. It barked once, then recognized Tahoma and came running, tail wagging furiously. "That's Matto," Tahoma said, a hint of warmth entering his voice for the first time. "It means bear. He thinks he's fierce, but mostly he just eats too much and sleeps in the sun." The dog reached the wagon and ran alongside it, tongue lolling, clearly delighted by Tahoma's return. When they stopped, Matto immediately jumped up, trying to lick Tahoma's face. Tahoma pushed him down gently but firmly, speaking to him in Lakota. The dog's tail wagged even harder. Alice climbed down from the wagon, and Matto immediately turned his attention to her, sniffing her skirts with intense curiosity. She held out her hand tentatively, and the dog sniffed it, then licked her fingers. Despite everything, Alice found herself smiling. It had been years since she'd had a dog, since she'd had any pet at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "He likes you," Tahoma observed. "That's good." Matto is usually suspicious of strangers. Tahoma began unhitching the horses, and Alice stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with herself. The camp was simple, but surprisingly organized. Beside the fire pit sat a tripod for hanging cooking pots. Furs were stretched on frames for drying. Tools hung from pegs driven into the cabin's exterior wall. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose. "The cabin is small," Tahoma said, leading the horses toward the corral. "But you can stay there. I have a shelter in the trees where I sleep when the weather is good." "No," Alice protested immediately. "I can't take you home. I'll sleep outside or in the lean-to, or—" Tahoma looked at her steadily. "You are a guest. Guests are treated with respect. This is our way. You will sleep in the cabin." The firmness in his voice left no room for argument. Alice nodded, feeling the weight of his hospitality, the obligation it created. She had nothing to offer in return except gratitude, and even that felt inadequate. After tending to the horses, Tahoma showed Alice the cabin's interior. It was indeed small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a dirt floor packed hard by use. There was a raised platform along one wall that served as a bed, covered with buffalo robes and blankets. A small stove sat in the corner, its pipe extending through the sod roof. Shelves held supplies, cornmeal, beans, coffee, salt. Herbs hung drying from the ceiling beams. It smelled of wood smoke and sage, and something else Alice couldn't identify, something earthy and clean. "There's a spring upstream, about 50 yards, Tahoma said, pointing. "The water is good for drinking and washing. I'll show you in the morning. For now, rest. I'll prepare food." He left before Alice could respond, pulling the door closed behind him. She stood in the dim interior, suddenly alone for the first time since morning. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant murmur of the river and the pop of the fire outside. Alice set her carpetbag down on the bed platform and sat beside it, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the day crashed over her. She had come so far, sacrificed so much, and for what? To be rejected, humiliated, nearly arrested, to end up in a stranger's cabin in the middle of nowhere, dependent on the kindness of a man whose language and customs she barely understood. It was absurd. It was terrifying. And yet, looking around at the simple, honest space Tahoma had created for himself, Alice felt something unexpected: safety. She lay back on the buffalo robes, staring at the rough-hewn beams supporting the sod roof. Her body ached from travel and the fall, her shoulder throbbing with each breath. But the robes were soft beneath her, and the cabin was cool despite the afternoon heat. Her eyelids grew heavy. When Alice woke, the light coming through the small window had turned golden with evening. She sat up disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was. Then memory returned, and with it a wave of complicated emotions. She rose and straightened her dress as best she could, then ventured outside. Tahoma sat by the fire, tending a pot that hung from the tripod. The smell of cooking meat and vegetables made Alice's stomach growl. Mato lay beside him, head on his paws, watching the pot with hopeful eyes. The sky had turned spectacular shades of orange and pink, the sun balanced on the western horizon like a ball of flame. "You slept," Tahoma observed without turning around. "That's good! I didn't mean to," Alice said, feeling embarrassed. "I should have helped with supper." "There will be time for that," Tahoma replied. He gestured to a log that had been positioned near the fire as a seat. "Sit, eat." Alice sat, accepting the bowl he handed her. It contained a stew of rabbit, wild onions, and something that might have been turnips, seasoned with herbs she didn't recognize. It was simple but delicious, warming her from the inside. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the hills, the sky darkening from orange to purple to deep blue. As darkness fell, stars began to emerge, more stars than Alice had ever seen in her life. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. She stared upward, transfixed. "In my language, we call it the Spirit Road," Tahoma said quietly, following her gaze. "The path souls take when they leave this world. It's beautiful," Alice whispered. They sat by the fire as it burned down to coals, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. Alice felt the day's tension slowly draining from her body, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Eventually Tahoma stood. "Sleep," he said. "Tomorrow we talk about what comes next." Alice nodded and returned to the cabin. She removed her boots and outer dress, lying down in her chemise and petticoat beneath the soft robes. Through the small window, she could see stars and hear the river's endless song. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, Alice felt something like peace. She thought of Mrs. Caldwell's cruel words, of Vernon's cowardice, of the life she'd left behind in Boston. Then she thought of Tahoma's steady presence, his unexpected kindness, the way he'd defended her without hesitation. She thought of his words about taking the next step and the next one after that. Tomorrow she would figure out what came next. Tonight she would simply rest. Outside, Tahoma sat by the dying fire a while longer, Mato's warm bulk pressed against his leg. He thought about the woman now sleeping in his cabin, about the cruelty he'd witnessed in town, about the complicated tangle of emotions her presence stirred in him. He'd been alone for 3 years, choosing solitude over the complications of his changing world. But something about Alice Winters had called to him, had reminded him that isolation, while safe, was also a kind of death. He looked up at the Spirit Road blazing across the sky and wondered what the ancestors would think of this choice he'd made, bringing a white woman to his camp. Then he decided it didn't matter. He'd spoken the truth in town, and he'd acted according to his conscience. That would have to be enough. The fire finally died to ash, and Tahoma rose, Mato following him to the shelter he'd built in the trees. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own decisions. But for tonight, they would all rest. Morning arrived with the sound of birds calling from the willows and the soft rush of the river over stones. Alice woke slowly, her body stiff from the previous day's ordeal, but somehow more rested than she'd been in months. Sunlight streamed through the small window, painting golden rectangles across the packed earth floor. For a moment, she lay still beneath the buffalo robes, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place, trying to orient herself to a reality that still felt dreamlike and strange. She rose and dressed in the same travel-worn clothes from yesterday, wishing desperately for clean garments and the ability to properly wash. Her reflection in the small tin mirror hanging on the wall showed a woman with tangled hair, dust still clinging to her skin despite her attempts to brush it away last night, and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than just one difficult day. She looked every one of her 32 years, and then some. When Alice emerged from the cabin, she found Tahoma already awake and working. He stood near the corral, brushing down one of the horses with long, steady strokes. Mato lay in a patch of sunlight nearby, watching with lazy contentment. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the distant hills. Smoke rose from the fire pit, where a pot of something sat warming on the coals. Tahoma looked up as she approached, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing toward the fire. "And cornmeal mush. Not fancy, but it fills the stomach." "Thank you," Alice said, moving toward the fire. She found a tin cup hanging from a hook nearby and poured herself coffee from the battered pot. It was strong and bitter, nothing like the refined breakfast blends she'd served in her Boston boarding house, but it was hot, and it cleared the fog from her mind. She ladled some of the cornmeal mush into a wooden bowl and ate standing up, watching Tahoma work. He moved with efficient grace, his hands confident and gentle as they moved over the horse's coat. The animal stood calmly, clearly trusting him completely. Alice noticed details she'd missed yesterday, the way Tahoma's long hair was now tied. Back with a strip of leather, the beadwork on his moccasins that depicted what might have been running horses, the several rings on his fingers that caught the morning light. "I should show you the spring," Tahoma said, finishing with the horse, and turning to face her. "And the surrounding area. It's important you know where things are." Alice nodded, setting down her empty bowl. She followed him upstream along the river's edge, Mato trotting ahead of them like a scout. The morning was growing warmer, but the shade of the willows kept the path cool. Birds flitted through the branches overhead, and Alice caught glimpses of fish moving in the clear water. They walked in silence for several minutes before Tahoma spoke. "You're wondering what happens next," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Alice admitted. "I don't want to impose on your hospitality longer than necessary, but I also don't know where else to go. The stage won't leave for 2 weeks, and even then, I'm not sure I have enough money for passage all the way back to Boston." Tahoma was quiet for a moment, navigating around a fallen log. "Why would you want to go back to Boston?" he asked. "What's waiting for you there?" The question was so direct, so unflinching, that Alice found herself answering with equal honesty. "Nothing," she said. "Absolutely nothing. I sold my boarding house, my possessions. The few friends I had will have moved on with their lives. I'd be starting over with less than nothing." "Then don't go back," Tahoma said simply. Alice stopped walking, staring at him. "What do you mean?" Tahoma turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. "This territory is full of people starting over, people running from something or towards something, or just trying to survive. You could stay, find work, build a new life here." "Doing what?" Alice asked, hearing the bitterness in her own voice. "I'm too old to be a mail-order bride, apparently, too refined for ranch work, too educated to be a laundress or a cook in some filthy mining camp." "You're educated," Tahoma said, latching onto that detail. "You can read and write." "Yes, but many cannot," he interrupted. "Many white settlers, and most of my people, education is valuable. You could teach," Alice laughed, but there was no humor in it. Teach where? In case you haven't noticed, I'm not exactly welcome in polite society. Mrs. Caldwell made sure. Everyone in Fort Laramie knows I'm desperate and unsuitable. Fort Laramie isn't the only settlement, Tahoma pointed out. They had reached the spring, which bubbled up from rocks into a clear pool before flowing into the river. There are smaller places, homesteads scattered across the territory, mining camps that are becoming towns, places where no one knows your story and no one cares about your age. Alice knelt beside the spring, cupping water in her hands and splashing it on her face. It was shockingly cold, fed by snowmelt from the distant mountains. The shock of it helped clear her thoughts. "You make it sound so simple," she said. "It's not simple," Tahoma replied, kneeling on the opposite side of the pool. "Nothing worth doing is simple, but it's possible. That's more than many people have." Alice studied his face across the water, seeing the conviction there. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. You owe me nothing." Tahoma was silent for a long moment, trailing his fingers through the cold water. "3 years ago," he said finally, "my wife and daughter died. Smallpox. It came through the reservation, killed many. I wasn't there. I was away, trading, trying to earn money, because the government rations weren't enough to keep us fed. When I came back, they were already buried." Alice's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." He held up a hand. "After that, I left. I couldn't stay on the reservation, couldn't live with the memories. I built this place, lived alone. I told myself it was better this way, safer. If you don't care about anyone, you can't lose them." "But," Alice prompted softly when he fell silent, "but yesterday, watching them treat you like you were worthless, like your life had no value because of something as meaningless as age, it reminded me that cruelty is cruelty, whether it comes from soldiers forcing people onto reservations or from supposedly civilized ladies in silk dresses. And I remembered that before everything fell apart, my wife used to say that when you see someone suffering and you have the power to help, you have the responsibility to help." Alice felt tears prickling at her eyes. "Your wife sounds like..." "She was a wise woman." "She was," Tahoma said, his voice rough with emotion. "Her name was Winona. It means firstborn daughter. She was strong and kind, and she saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it." They stayed by the spring for a while longer, the weight of shared grief creating an unexpected connection between them. Finally, Tahoma rose. "Come," he said, "there's more to show you." He led her along a different path, climbing up the hillside behind his camp. The ascent was steep, and Alice's legs burned with the effort, but when they reached the top, she gasped at the view. The river valley spread out below them, a patchwork of green and gold. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from what might have been other homesteads or camps. The sky stretched endlessly above, vast and blue and unlimited. "This is what I see every morning," Tahoma said. "This is why I stay. Not because the life is easy, but because it's real. Because out here, a person's worth isn't determined by their age or their family name or how much money they have. It's determined by their character, their strength, their willingness to face each day and keep going." Alice turned to him, studying his profile as he gazed out over the valley. "You're trying to convince me to stay," she said. "I'm trying to convince you that you have options," he replied. "That what happened yesterday wasn't the end of your story, just a bad chapter. You get to decide what comes next." They descended back to camp in thoughtful silence. When they arrived, Tahoma went to check on the horses, while Alice sat by the fire pit, turning his words over in her mind. Could she really stay in this territory? Build a new life from nothing? The idea was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Over the next several days, a rhythm developed. Alice woke early, helped prepare breakfast, and then accompanied Tahoma as he went about his daily work. She learned how he trapped rabbits and other small game for food, how he collected edible plants from the prairie, how he tended to the horses and maintained his camp. He taught her which plants were medicinal and which were poisonous, how to read the weather in the behavior of animals and the movement of clouds. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked. Tahoma spoke of his people, of the way of life that was rapidly disappearing as more settlers arrived and the government pushed his people onto ever smaller parcels of land. He spoke without anger, but with a deep sadness that Alice felt in her own chest. She, in turn, told him about Boston, about running her boarding house, about the endless parade of lonely people who had passed through her establishment, each carrying their own stories of loss and hope. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Alice was washing clothes at the river when 3 riders appeared on the opposite bank. They were rough-looking men, armed with rifles, their faces hard and suspicious. Alice's heart began to pound as they crossed the shallow ford, water splashing up around their horses' legs. "Well, well," one of them called out, a man with a scarred face and tobacco-stained teeth. "What do we have here? A white woman living with a savage?" Alice stood slowly, her hands dripping. "I'm a guest here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just passing through." "Passing through for a week," another rider said with a nasty laugh. "We've been watching. Seen you helping the Indian with his chores, sleeping in his cabin. That's not passing through, lady. That's something else entirely." "You don't know what you're talking about," Alice said, anger overriding her fear. "Mr. Blackhorse has been nothing but honorable." "Mr. Blackhorse," the scarred man mocked. "You hear that, boys? The squaw man's got himself a fancy title now." Matto appeared then, barking furiously at the intruders. One of the men reached for his rifle, and Alice felt ice flood her veins. "Touch that dog and you'll regret it," came Tahoma's voice, calm but carrying unmistakable threat. He emerged from the trees, his own rifle held loosely but ready. "You're on my land. State your business or leave." The 3 riders exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. The scarred man spat into the dirt. "Just wanted to see if the rumors were true. Tahoma Blackhorse taking in white women now. Guess you figure if you can't have your own kind, you'll settle for their cast-offs." Alice saw Tahoma's jaw tighten, but his voice remained level. "Last chance. Leave now, or I'll assume you came. Here looking for trouble." The riders clearly didn't like being challenged, but they also weren't stupid enough to start a gunfight when they were outnumbered by factors they couldn't see. For all they knew, Tahoma had others hidden in the trees. The scarred man jerked his horse's head around viciously. "This ain't over," he snarled. "People are talking. The army gets wind of a white woman living with an Indian. They're gonna come asking questions." "Let them come," Tahoma said. "I'll tell them the same thing I'm telling you. I helped someone who needed help. That's all." The riders crossed back over the ford and disappeared into the prairie, but the threat they represented lingered like smoke. Alice realized she was shaking. Tahoma lowered his rifle and moved to her side. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she managed. "Just frightened." "Who were they?" "Drifters, probably. Maybe bounty hunters looking for army deserters or escaped reservation Indians. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they'll talk and word will spread." Alice understood what he wasn't saying. Her presence here was putting him in danger. The fragile peace he'd built for himself was being threatened by her very existence. "I should go," she said quietly. "I should leave before I cause you more trouble." Tahoma looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" Alice thought about it, really thought about it. Did she want to leave this place, this unexpected sanctuary? Did she want to return to Fort Laramie and try to book passage back to Boston, back to a life that no longer existed? Or did she want something different, something she could barely articulate even to herself? "No," she said finally. "No, I don't want to leave. But I don't want to bring trouble to your door either. Trouble finds us, whether we invite it or not," Tahoma said. "The question is whether we face it alone or together." The word together hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Alice met his eyes and saw her own uncertainty reflected back at her, mixed with something else, something that made her breath catch. That evening, they sat by the fire as usual, but the easy comfort of previous nights had been replaced by tension. Finally, Alice broke the silence. "Tell me honestly," she said, "if I stay, if I try to build a life here in this territory, what are my real chances?" Tahoma poked at the fire with a stick, sending up sparks. "Honestly, it won't be easy. You'll face prejudice for having associated with me. You'll be judged harshly by other settlers, but you're educated, capable, and stronger than you think. You could survive. More than survive, possibly. But you'd need to be somewhere other than Fort Laramie, somewhere you could start fresh." "Where?" Alice asked. "There's a settlement about 3 days' ride from here. Deadwood Gulch. It started as a mining camp, but it's growing into a real town. They're getting families now, children who need schooling. I know someone there, a man named Jacob Reeves who runs the mercantile. He's fair-minded, doesn't judge people by their past. I could take you there, introduce you, help you get established." Alice felt something shift inside her, a decision crystallizing. "You'd do that for me?" "Yes," Tahoma said simply. "Why?" she asked, not for the first time. "Why do you keep helping me?" Tahoma set down the stick he'd been using to tend the fire. He looked at her directly, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Because 3 years ago I gave up on connecting with anyone. I decided it was easier to be alone. But you've reminded me that sometimes the hard thing and the right thing are the same. And because," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because when I look at you, I don't see someone who's too old or too worn or too anything. I see someone who's survived, who's kept going despite everything. That deserves respect." Alice felt heat in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. "I see the same in you," she said softly. "Survival, strength, honor." They sat in charged silence, the night deepening around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, lonely and wild. Matto lifted his head, listening, then settled back down with a contented sigh. "We'll leave for Deadwood Gulch in 2 days," Tahoma said eventually. "That gives you time to prepare, to be certain this is what you want." "I'm certain," Alice said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "For the first time in years, I actually feel certain about something." Tahoma nodded, and if Alice wasn't mistaken, there was approval in his expression, maybe even something more. "Then we have a plan," he said. That night, lying in the cabin beneath the buffalo robes, Alice stared at the rough ceiling and felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. She was about to step into the unknown again, but this time it felt different. This time she wasn't running toward a promise someone else had made. She was choosing her own path, creating her own future, and she wasn't doing it entirely alone. The first snow came early that year, dusting the prairie with white in mid-October when the leaves were still clinging to the cottonwoods. Alice woke to find the world transformed, everything softened and quieted by the unexpected blanket of powder. She stood at the cabin door, wrapped in one of Tahoma's blankets, watching her breath form clouds in the cold air, marveling at how quickly the seasons turned in this unforgiving land. 3 months had passed since that humiliating day at Fort Laramie. 3 months of learning to live in a way she'd never imagined, of discovering strengths she didn't know she possessed. Her hands, once soft and city-pale, were now weathered and capable. She could start a fire in minutes, skin a rabbit without flinching, read the sky for coming weather. She could understand more Lakota words than she could speak, and Tahoma's English had become peppered with phrases she'd taught him from Boston, creating a language uniquely their own. But with the snow came a new reality that neither of them had spoken about directly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Winter on the Dakota prairie was brutal, deadly to those unprepared. And Alice's presence, which had begun as a temporary refuge, had quietly become something more permanent. Neither had discussed her leaving. Neither had made plans for her to return east. The subject hung between them like smoke, visible but intangible, something they both acknowledged without words. Tahoma emerged from the trees where his shelter stood, his breath steaming, Matto bounding through the fresh snow beside him. He stopped when he saw Alice at the door, and something passed between them in that moment of stillness. A recognition, an acceptance of what they'd both been avoiding. "Winter comes," he said simply. Stating the obvious, "Yes," Alice replied, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. He crossed the distance between them, his footsteps crunching in the snow. "We need to talk," he said, his voice serious. "There are things we must decide." They sat by the fire inside the cabin, the door closed against the cold, and for the first time addressed the question that had been growing between them like the changing seasons. Alice's money was long gone, spent on basic supplies during trips to Fort Laramie. The last stagecoach east had departed 2 weeks ago and wouldn't return until spring. Even if she wanted to leave, she was trapped here by weather and circumstance. "You can't stay here as you are," Tahoma said, his words careful, measured. "People in town have already begun to talk. They see a white woman living with a Lakota man, and their minds make assumptions. Some are angry, some are dangerous." Alice had noticed it too during their last supply run. The stares that lasted too long, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Mrs. Davenport, the banker's wife, had crossed the street rather than walk past them. 2 soldiers had made crude jokes just loud enough for her to hear. "What are you suggesting?" Alice asked, though she thought she knew. Tahoma looked at her directly, his dark eyes steady. "There are 2 paths. You can go to the reservation with the missionary women. They would take you in, give you work teaching the children. It would be respectable, safe." Or he paused, and Alice saw something vulnerable flash across his usually composed features. "Or," she prompted softly. "Or we marry," he said simply. "Not in the white man's church. They wouldn't allow it anyway. But in the traditional way, with witnesses from my people. It would give you protection under tribal law. And it would make your presence here legitimate in the eyes of those who might otherwise cause trouble." Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. Marriage. The word carried so much weight, so many expectations and obligations. She thought of Vernon Caldwell and his broken promises. She thought of Sam and the wedding that never happened. She thought of Mrs. Caldwell's cruel assessment that she was too old, too worn, too used up for any man to want. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You owe me nothing. You've already given me more than I had any right to expect." Tahoma was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was discovering them as he said them. "When I first saw you in that town, I saw someone who had been discarded, like the horses the white men shoot when they go lame. Like the old dogs they leave behind when they move on. It made me angry, this waste of something valuable." He turned to face her fully. "But these months, living near you, watching you learn and adapt and grow strong, you are not what they said you were. You are not too old. You are not used up. You are like the prairie grass that the buffalo herds pass over. It bends, it seems broken, but when the herd moves on, it stands again, stronger than before." Alice felt tears burning behind her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her this way, with such honest recognition of her worth. "I don't love you," she said, needing him to understand. "I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore. Sam took that part of me when he died." "I know," Tahoma said, "and I do not love you in the way the white man speaks of love, with poetry and promises of forever. But I respect you. I value your presence. I sleep better knowing you are near. Is that not also a kind of love? A more honest kind, perhaps?" The question hung between them, profound in its simplicity. Alice thought about the past 3 months, about the quiet companionship they'd built, the way they'd learned to move around each other, to anticipate needs, to communicate without words. She thought about the peace she felt here, the sense of belonging she'd never found in Boston's proper drawing rooms. "The missionary women," she said slowly. "What would that life be like?" Tahoma's expression grew somber. "Lonely, constrained. They would want you to help civilize the children, to make them forget their language, their customs. You would be expected to be grateful for their charity, to accept their judgment of what is right and proper. And in the spring, they would likely send you east, back to a world that has no place for you. Everything he said was true. Alice could picture it clearly, could see herself withering in that environment, becoming smaller and smaller until she disappeared entirely. The thought filled her with something close to panic. "And if we married," she said carefully, "what would change?" "Everything. Nothing," Tahoma replied. "You would have a place that no one could take from you. You would have the protection of my name, small as that protection may be in this changing world. We would continue as we are, but with the security of commitment, with the knowledge that neither of us is alone." Alice stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the snow that was already beginning to melt in the morning sun. She thought about all the choices that had brought her to this moment: the decision to answer Vernon's letter, the journey west, the humiliation at Fort Laramie. Each choice had seemed to narrow her options, to close doors behind her. But maybe they had actually been opening a path she'd never imagined, leading her to a life that existed outside the rigid expectations of the world she'd known. "How would it work?" she asked, turning back to face him. "The ceremony." Tahoma stood as well, his posture straightening with purpose. "We would need witnesses from my band. I have cousins who live 2 days' ride north who have managed to stay off the reservation. They would come if I sent word. The ceremony itself is simple, an exchange of gifts, words spoken before witnesses, a feast to celebrate the union, and after, what would be expected of me? To be my partner, Tahoma said, to share the work and the rewards, to stand beside me, not behind me. In my people's way, women have always had power, voices that matter. It is not like the white man's marriage, where the woman becomes property. Alice absorbed this, comparing it to everything she'd been taught about a wife's duties and subservience. What Tahoma described sounded less like a cage and more like a true partnership. Still, doubts gnawed at her. "People will hate us for this," she said quietly. "Both our peoples. The whites will say I've degraded myself. Your people may say you've betrayed them by taking a white woman." "Yes," Tahoma agreed simply. "That is true. But hatred from others is easier to bear than hatred of oneself. If you refuse this because you fear their judgment, you give them power over your life. If you refuse because you truly do not want this path, that is different. That is your right." The choice crystallized in that moment with unexpected clarity. Alice had spent so much of her life trying to be what others wanted: the dutiful daughter, the patient fiancée, the respectable boarding house proprietor, the mail-order bride. Each role had been chosen to meet someone else's expectations, to fit into someone else's vision of what she should be. And each had ended in disappointment or disaster. For the first time, she had the opportunity to choose something for herself, not because it was proper or expected, not because it would please her family or society, but because it felt right in a way nothing else ever had. "Yes," she said, the word emerging stronger than she expected. "I'll marry you. In your way, with your people as witnesses. If you're certain this is what you want," something that might have been relief passed across Tahoma's features. "I am certain," he said, "more certain than I have been about anything in a long time." They stood facing each other across the cabin, and then Tahoma extended his hand. Alice took it, feeling the calloused warmth of his palm against hers. They didn't embrace, didn't kiss, didn't perform any of the romantic gestures that would have accompanied such a moment in her old world. But there was something profound in that simple hand clasp, a commitment made without pretty words or grand gestures. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Tahoma sent a message north with a fur trader heading that direction, and within 10 days his cousins arrived. 3 of them, two men named Tatanka and Chaske, and a woman called Winona, who regarded Alice with frank, assessing eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of Mrs. Caldwell's initial appraisal. But where Mrs. Caldwell had seen only age and inadequacy, Winona seemed to be measuring different qualities. "You work?" Winona asked in halting English, watching Alice prepare food. "Yes," Alice replied. "I work." Winona nodded, said something in rapid Lakota to Tahoma. He responded, and whatever he said made Winona laugh. She turned back to Alice and said something that Tahoma translated. "She says you are skinny, but you will survive the winter. This is high praise from Winona," he said with a hint of amusement. The cousins stayed in the lean-to, and their presence transformed the quiet camp into something more communal. There was laughter in the evenings, stories told in Lakota that Tahoma would sometimes translate for Alice's benefit. She learned that Tatanka and Chaske were brothers who had refused to go to the reservation, choosing instead to live as their ancestors had, moving with the seasons and the game. Winona was Chaske's wife, a woman of formidable skills who could track deer, tan hides, and deliver babies with equal competence. They brought gifts for the wedding ceremony, a dress of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork that Winona had made specifically for this occasion, a pair of moccasins that fit Alice's feet perfectly, and a beautiful blanket woven in patterns that Winona explained represented protection and prosperity. Alice had no gifts to offer in return, except her labor and her determination to learn. She spent hours with Winona, absorbing knowledge about plants that could heal and which roots could be eaten safely. She learned how to properly flesh a hide, how to smoke meat so it would last through the winter, how to sew with sinew and create waterproof seams. On the day before the ceremony, Winona took Alice to the river despite the cold. Through a mixture of Lakota, English, and gestures, she explained that Alice must wash and prepare herself. The older woman was surprisingly gentle as she helped Alice bathe in the frigid water, singing softly in Lakota. Then she braided Alice's hair in a style Alice had never worn before, weaving in small shells and beads. "You are becoming new," Winona said carefully in English. "Old life gone, new life starts." That evening, Tahoma's cousins built a large fire and prepared the feast. A deer that Tatanka had taken that morning roasted over the flames. There were roots and dried berries, cornbread made from the meal. Alice had carefully rationed, and even coffee, a luxury that Chaske had brought as his gift. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the snowy prairie, the small group gathered around the fire. Alice wore the deerskin dress Winona had made, and Tahoma wore traditional clothing she'd never seen before, leather leggings decorated with quill work, a shirt of soft hide, and a vest heavy with beadwork. His hair was unbound, and he wore a single eagle feather. There was no officiant, no priest or judge. Instead, Tatanka spoke first in Lakota, his voice carrying across the quiet camp. Tahoma translated in a low voice for Alice's benefit. "He says the old ways are dying, but some things remain true. A man and a woman who choose to walk together deserve respect and recognition. He asks the spirits to witness this union and to grant us strength for the path ahead." Then Chask spoke, and again Tahoma translated. "He says he has watched us these past days and sees that we move well together, like two horses who have learned each other's pace. He says this is the foundation of a good marriage, not passion that burns hot and dies quickly, but respect that burns steady and gives warmth through all seasons." Winona was last, and she spoke directly to Alice in a mixture of Lakota and English, her weathered face serious. "You leave your people, this is hard, but you gain new people. We are your family now. When you need help, you call. We come. This is the promise." Then it was time for the exchange of gifts. Alice had spent weeks working on hers in secret. creating a shirt for Tahoma using skills Winona had taught her. The stitching wasn't perfect, and the beadwork was simple compared to the intricate patterns the Lakota women created. But every stitch represented hours of careful labor and determination. Tahoma accepted it with visible emotion, running his fingers over the beadwork. "You made this," he said, not a question but a statement of wonder. "I did," Alice confirmed. "Winona helped, but the work is mine." Tahoma's gift to her was a knife in a decorated sheath, the handle carved from antler and polished smooth. "For protection," he said, "and for work. A good knife is a partner in survival." The practicality of the gift, the implicit trust it represented, moved Alice more than any jewelry ever could have. She accepted it with both hands, understanding its significance. Then Tahoma took her hands in his and spoke in English, clearly wanting her to understand every word without translation. "I cannot promise you an easy life. I cannot promise you safety from the changes that are coming to this land. But I promise you respect. I promise you will never be discarded or diminished. I promise to stand with you, to share equally in work and in rest. These things I can promise, and these things I will keep." Alice's throat tightened with emotion. She had prepared words, but found herself departing from them, speaking from a deeper place. "I cannot promise I will always understand your ways, or that I won't make mistakes. But I promise to try. I promise to learn. I promise to be a true partner, to carry my share of every burden. And I promise that I will never leave unless you send me away." "I will never send you away," Tahoma said firmly. Tatanka spoke again, his voice rising in what sounded like a blessing or a prayer. Then he took a blanket and wrapped it around both of them, binding them together. The others began to sing, a haunting melody that sent chills down Alice's spine despite the fire's warmth. And just like that, simply and profoundly, they were married. The feast that followed was joyful, with Chasky telling stories that made everyone laugh, even though Alice only understood half of what was said. Tatanka played a drum, and Winona sang. They ate until they were full, and then they ate more, celebrating not just a wedding, but survival itself, the stubborn refusal to let hardship extinguish joy. Later, when the fire had burned down and the cousins had retired to the lean-to, Alice and Tahoma stood outside the cabin, wrapped in the blanket that had bound them during the ceremony. The stars blazed overhead, and the prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, white with snow and luminous under the moon. "Are you afraid?" Tahoma asked quietly. Alice considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted. "But not of this. Not of you. I'm afraid of everything that exists beyond this moment. The winter, the future, the changes you spoke of. But right now, in this moment, I'm not afraid." "See, that's enough," Tahoma said. "That's all we ever have. This moment, and then the next one and the next. We'll face what comes together." They stood in silence, two people from different worlds who had found unexpected common ground. Behind them, the cabin waited with its simple comforts. Around them, the vast Dakota prairie stretched endlessly, indifferent to human concerns. Above them, the spirit road blazed across the sky. Alice thought of the woman she'd been 3 months ago, climbing down from that stagecoach with her carefully packed bag and her desperate hopes. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. She'd been broken by rejection and humiliation, but like the prairie grass Tahoma had compared her to, she'd stood back up. And in standing, she'd discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. "We should go inside," Tahoma said finally. "Tomorrow we'll need to check the horses and make sure we have enough wood for the winter." Ever practical, Alice thought with a smile. But she appreciated that too, the way he grounded everything in the tangible and the real. "Yes," she agreed. "Tomorrow we work. Tonight we rest." They entered the cabin together. Husband and wife, not by the authority of church or state, but by their own choice and the witness of people who understood what it meant to make a life in an unforgiving land. It wasn't the future Alice had imagined when she'd left Boston, but it was hers. chosen freely, built on respect and partnership rather than romantic illusion. And as she lay down that night beside the man who was now her husband, listening to the wind whisper around the cabin walls, Alice felt something she hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, which seemed too fragile and fleeting a thing, but contentment, the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, Matto howled once at the moon, then settled down to sleep. The fire in the pit burned to coals. The snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the prairie in a fresh white blanket. And in the small cabin by the river, two people who had both known loss and loneliness slept peacefully. No longer alone. Spring arrived late that year, grudging and reluctant, as if winter was unwilling to relinquish its grip on the Dakota territory. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and muddy earth, and the river swelled with runoff from the distant mountains. Alice stood at the edge of the swollen water, watching it rush past with a force that seemed almost angry, carrying branches and debris in its churning current. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the subtle swell there, the secret she'd been carrying for 2 months now. She hadn't told Tahoma yet. Part of her wanted to wait until she was certain, until the quickening came, and there could be no doubt. But another part of her was simply afraid. Afraid of what it would mean, afraid of the responsibility, afraid that at 33 she was indeed too old for this, that Mrs. Caldwell's cruel assessment would prove prophetic after all. The fear sat in her chest like a stone, cold and heavy. Behind her, she heard footsteps crunching through the wet snow. Tahoma approached, carrying his rifle and a brace of rabbits he'd taken that morning. His face was weathered from the harsh winter, new lines carved around his eyes, but there was a contentment in his expression that hadn't been there when they'd first met. "The river is high," he observed, coming to stand beside her. "It will be dangerous for another week at least." "Yes," Alice agreed, then took a breath. "Tahoma, there's something I need to tell you." He turned to look at her, his dark eyes attentive. "You've been quiet these past weeks. I thought perhaps you were regretting your choice, thinking of the life you left behind." "No," Alice said quickly. "Not regret, just fear. She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm carrying a child." "Your child?" The rabbits fell from Tahoma's hands, forgotten. His expression cycled through surprise, wonder, and something that might have been fear of his own. "You're certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation. But yes, I'm certain. I felt the changes in my body, the sickness in the mornings that Winona told me about. By my calculations, the baby will come in late summer." Tahoma was silent for a long moment, staring at the rushing river as if it held answers. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured. "This is not what we planned. We spoke of partnership, of survival. We did not speak of children." "I know," Alice said, her own fear crystallizing into defensiveness. "If you don't want this, if you want me to—" "No," Tahoma interrupted sharply, turning to face her fully. "Do not finish that thought. I did not say I don't want this. I said it was not planned. These are different things." He reached out and placed his hand gently on her belly, his palm warm through the fabric of her dress. "A child born between worlds," he said softly. "Neither fully white nor fully Lakota. The road will be hard for this one. The road is hard for everyone," Alice replied, covering his hand with her own. "We'll teach them to walk it anyway." A smile tugged at the corner of Tahoma's mouth. "Them? You think there's more than one?" "Dear God, I hope not," Alice said, and they both laughed, the tension breaking like ice in spring thaw. But the laughter faded quickly, replaced by the weight of practical concerns. "We'll need supplies," Tahoma said, his mind already working through the logistics. "Medicine, cloth for diapers and clothing. Perhaps Winona could come stay when the time gets close." "That would require a trip to Fort Laramie," Alice said, anxiety creeping into her voice. "I haven't been back since—" "I know," Tahoma said, "but we'll need to go regardless. We're low on flour and coffee, and I need ammunition. We can't avoid it forever." The thought of returning to Fort Laramie filled Alice with dread. She imagined encountering the Caldwells, or worse, the people who had witnessed her humiliation. But Tahoma was right. They couldn't live in isolation forever, especially not with a child coming. 2 weeks later, they made the journey. The wagon rumbled along the muddy trail, and Alice sat beside Tahoma with her heart hammering against her ribs. She dressed carefully in her best remaining dress from Boston, cleaned and mended repeatedly. She wanted to appear respectable, successful, a woman who had landed on her feet despite everything. Fort Laramie had changed little in the months since she'd left. The same dusty streets, the same weathered buildings, the same mix of soldiers and traders and desperate dreamers. But Alice had changed. She sat straighter now, her hands no longer soft but capable, her face tanned from sun and wind. The woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 6 months ago would barely recognize her. They tied the wagon outside the general store, and Alice steeled herself before climbing down. Almost immediately she felt eyes on them. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A woman crossing the street stopped and stared openly. "Let them look," Tahoma said quietly, offering his arm. "We have nothing to be ashamed of." Alice took his arm, grateful for his steady presence. They entered the store together, and the proprietor, a thin man with spectacles named Mr. Henderson, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened in recognition. "Miss Winters," he said, then corrected himself. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Blackhorse now, if the rumors are true." "The rumors are true," Alice said firmly. "And yes, it's Mrs. Blackhorse." Mr. Henderson's expression was difficult to read, caught somewhere between disapproval and reluctant respect. "Well then, what can I help you folks with today?" They made their purchases. Flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, and fabric for baby clothes that Alice picked out with trembling fingers. Mr. Henderson tallied the costs without comment, though Alice caught him glancing at her belly when he thought she wasn't looking. Word would spread quickly, she knew. By nightfall, everyone in Fort Laramie would know that Tahoma Blackhorse's white wife was expecting. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, a familiar voice cut through the afternoon air. Well, the rejected bride returns." Alice turned to find Constance Caldwell standing on the boardwalk outside the dress shop, her expression gleaming with malicious pleasure. She looked much as Alice remembered, overdressed for frontier life, her face pinched with perpetual dissatisfaction. "Miss Caldwell," Alice said evenly, refusing to be baited. "It's Mrs. Fletcher now," Constance corrected smugly. "I married a lieutenant from the fort. A proper marriage in a church with respectable witnesses. Not some savage ceremony in the wilderness." Tahoma's hand found Alice's back, a subtle gesture of support. Alice felt anger rising in her chest, but forced it down. "I'm happy for you," she said, meaning none of it. "I hope you find joy in your proper marriage." "Joy?" Constance laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "At least I haven't degraded myself. At least my children won't be half-breed mongrels." The words were like a slap, designed to wound. But before Alice could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "That's quite enough. Constance." Alice turned in surprise to find Mrs. Sarah Henderson, the store owner's wife, emerging from the shop. She was a formidable woman in her 50s, known for her sharp tongue and sharper business sense. She'd always been civil to Alice during previous supply runs, nothing more. "Mrs. Henderson," Constance said, clearly surprised by the interruption. "I was merely being cruel for no reason other than your own small-mindedness," Mrs. Henderson finished. She turned to Alice with an expression that was almost kind. "Don't listen to her, dear. I've known Constance since she was a girl, and she's always delighted in other people's misery. Probably because her own marriage is making her miserable." Constance's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "I dare because I'm too old to care what people think," Mrs. Henderson said. "Now run along before you say something even more foolish." Constance fled, her skirts swishing with indignation. Mrs. Henderson watched her go, then turned back to Alice. "I heard you married the Blackhorse man. I heard it was a good match, that he treats you well." "He does," Alice said, surprised by the woman's kindness. "That's what matters then," Mrs. Henderson said. "Not what people say, not what they think they know." Whether you're treated well and whether you're happy. The rest is just noise. She patted Alice's arm once, briefly, then returned to her store. The gesture was small, but it meant more to Alice than she could express. One voice of support in a sea of judgment. They finished loading the wagon in silence, but as they prepared to leave, Tahoma suddenly stopped. "Wait here," he said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Where are you going?" Alice asked. "There's something I need to do," he said, and walked toward the sheriff's office before she could protest. Alice waited, confused and increasingly anxious, until Tahoma emerged 15 minutes later with Sheriff Daniels, a gruff man in his 50s who'd been present during the incident with Mrs. Caldwell. They walked together toward the wagon, and Alice's heart sank, fearing trouble. "Mrs. Blackhorse," Sheriff Daniels said, tipping his hat. "Your husband here tells me you're expecting a child." "Yes," Alice said cautiously, unsure where this was leading. "He also tells me you're concerned about the birth. Being so far from town and from proper medical help," the sheriff continued. "I wanted you to know that Dr. Morrison over at the fort has agreed to come out when your time arrives, if we send word. No charge. He says it's the Christian thing to do." Alice was stunned. "I don't understand." "Why would he?" "Because I asked him to," Sheriff Daniels said gruffly. "Look, I'm not going to pretend I understand your choice or approve of it. But I saw what happened to you last summer, saw how you were treated, and I figure you deserve at least a fair chance at bringing a healthy baby into this world." Tears burned Alice's eyes. "Thank you," she managed. Truly, thank you." The sheriff nodded, clearly uncomfortable with emotion. "Just send word when the time comes. We'll make sure the doctor gets to you." He walked away, and Alice turned to Tahoma, who was climbing back onto the wagon. "You arranged that?" she asked. "I told him about the baby. I told him we needed help. The rest he offered on his own," Tahoma said. "There is more kindness in the world than we sometimes see. We just have to give people the chance to show it." The ride back to camp was quiet, both of them processing the day's events. Alice thought about Constance's cruelty and Mrs. Henderson's unexpected support, about the sheriff's gruff kindness and the doctor's willingness to help. The world, she realized, was more complicated than simple categories of acceptance and rejection. There would always be people who judged and people who helped, and navigating between them required strength she was still learning to possess. The months that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Winona arrived in late July, bringing with her a younger woman named Maka, who had experience with births. They took over the cabin with cheerful efficiency, filling it with herbs and medicines, preparing cloths and blankets, teaching Alice breathing techniques and positions that would ease the labor. The baby came on a sweltering August afternoon, when the sky was white with heat and the air felt too thick to breathe. The labor was long and brutal, lasting through the night and into the next day. Alice lost herself in waves of pain that seemed endless, certain at times that she would die, that Mrs. Caldwell's prophecy about her age would prove true after all. But Winona and Maka guided her through it with firm hands and encouraging words. Tahoma waited outside, pacing like a caged animal. Matto pressed anxiously against his leg. And finally, as the sun reached its zenith on the second day, a baby's cry split the air. "A girl," Winona announced, placing the squalling infant on Alice's chest. "Strong lungs? Good sign." Alice stared down at her daughter through tears of exhaustion and wonder. The baby had Tahoma's dark hair and Alice's pale skin, a visible blend of both their heritages. Her tiny fists waved in the air, and her cries were indeed strong, indignant at being forced into this bright, overwhelming world. Tahoma was allowed in once Alice had been cleaned and the baby swaddled. He approached slowly, almost reverently, staring at the tiny bundle in Alice's arms as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. "A daughter," Alice said softly. "We made a daughter." Tahoma reached out with one finger, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. Immediately her fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. Something in Tahoma's expression cracked, vulnerability flooding his features. "She's perfect," he whispered. "What should we call her?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her daughter's face, Alice knew exactly what felt right. "Hope," she said. "In English, Hope, but I'd like her to have a Lakota name too, one you choose." Tahoma was quiet for a long moment, studying his daughter's face. "Washinyan Wikapi," he said finally. "It means trustworthy star, because she is a light in darkness, something we can trust to guide us." "Hope Wakinyan Wikapi Blackhorse," Alice said, testing the full name. "It's beautiful." Winona stayed for 2 weeks, teaching Alice how to nurse the baby, how to soothe her cries, how to read the signs of illness or distress. Maka taught her songs in Lakota to sing while rocking Hope to sleep. And slowly, terrifyingly, wonderfully, Alice began to understand that she was a mother now, responsible for this tiny life in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. When Winona finally prepared to leave, she pulled Alice aside. "You will be a good mother," she said in her careful English. "Not because you know everything, but because you will learn. That is what matters. What if I fail her?" Alice asked, voicing the fear that haunted her nights. "All mothers fail their children sometimes," Winona said wisely. "But the good ones keep trying anyway." "You will keep trying. I see this in you." After Winona left, life settled into a new rhythm. The baby demanded constant attention, and Alice found herself more exhausted than she'd ever been, even during those first brutal months of learning frontier life. But there was also joy, unexpected and profound, in the weight of Hope's small body against her chest, in the milky smell of her breath, in the way Tahoma's stern face softened completely whenever he held his daughter. One evening in early autumn, when Hope was 2 months old and the prairie was painted with gold and crimson, they received unexpected visitors. Sheriff Daniels arrived with Dr. Morrison, who'd come to check on the baby as promised. The doctor examined Hope thoroughly, pronouncing her healthy and thriving. "You've done well, Mrs. Blackhorse," he said approvingly. "Many women in your situation wouldn't have managed so successfully." Before they left, Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat awkwardly. "There's one more thing," he said. "The territorial governor has been pushing for official birth registrations. If you want your daughter to have legal standing, to be able to own property or attend school someday, you'll need to register her birth." He pulled out a form and a pencil. "I can file it for you if you'd like. Save you the trip to town." Alice and Tahoma exchanged glances. This was a complication they hadn't anticipated, a way for the government to document and control their daughter's existence. But the sheriff was right about the practical implications. "What information do you need?" Tahoma asked cautiously. The sheriff went through the form. Date of birth, parents' names, place of birth. When he got to race, he paused. "For the mother, I'll put white. But for the father," he looked at Tahoma, "I can put Indian or I can put mixed blood. Your choice." "Put Lakota," Tahoma said firmly. "That is what I am." The sheriff nodded and wrote it down. "And for the child?" Alice looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. "Mixed," she said, "because that's the truth. She's both, and we won't hide either half of her heritage." When the visitors had gone, Alice stood outside the cabin holding Hope, looking up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed her humiliation and her wedding, her despair and her joy. The spirit road blazed overhead, and Alice wondered if her parents could see her from wherever they were now, if they would understand the choices she'd made. Tahoma emerged from the cabin and came to stand beside her. "You're thinking too much," he observed. "I'm thinking about how strange life is," Alice said. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, and now—" Tahoma prompted. Alice looked down at Hope's sleeping face, then up at her husband's steady presence. "Now I think maybe I had to lose everything to find what actually mattered. I had to become nothing before I could become something real." "You were always real," Tahoma said. "You just had to find a place where you could be seen." They stood together in the gathering darkness, a family cobbled together from rejection and circumstance, from courage and choice. Behind them, the cabin glowed with firelight. Around them, the prairie stretched endlessly, wild and free. Above them, the stars witnessed everything, keeping their ancient watch. Alice thought of the woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach with her carefully packed bag and desperate hopes. That woman was gone, transformed by hardship and acceptance into someone stronger, someone who'd learned that home wasn't a place you traveled to, but something you built with your own hands, from whatever materials life provided. Hope stirred in her arms, making the small, mewling sounds that meant she'd be hungry soon. Alice smiled and headed back toward the cabin, Tahoma following close behind. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, diapers to wash, food to prepare, wood to chop, endless work that never quite finished. But tonight, they had this moment of peace, this small, perfect space where a rejected bride had become a wife and mother, where an outsider had found her place. And in that cabin by the river under the watchful stars, Alice Winter's black horse rocked her daughter and sang a lullaby that mixed English words with Lakota phrases, creating something new from two different worlds. Just as Hope herself was something new, a bridge between cultures, a testament to the possibility that love could exist in unexpected places, between unexpected people. The fire crackled in the stove. Matto snored in the corner. Tahoma sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with familiar, methodical movements. And Alice held her daughter close, breathing in her sweet scent, marveling at the impossible journey that had brought her here. From mail-order bride to rejected woman to Lakota, wife to mother. Each transformation had been painful, but each had been necessary. And now, finally, she was simply Alice, a woman who'd learned that being thrown away wasn't an ending, but a beginning, that falling could lead to being caught, that losing everything could mean gaining something far more valuable than what was lost. Outside, the prairie wind whispered its ancient songs. The river flowed endlessly toward distant oceans, and in a small cabin built on determination and defended by choice, a family that shouldn't exist by any conventional measure proved that sometimes the best lives are the ones nobody planned, the ones that grow wild and strong in the spaces between expectations. 10 years had carved their mark on the Dakota territory like wind-shaped stone. Alice stood at the edge of what was no longer just a camp, but a proper homestead, watching her 3 children play near the river's edge under the watchful eye of their oldest, Hope, who at 10 had inherited her father's serious nature and her mother's stubborn determination. The twins, Sam and Sarah, named for the ghosts Alice had finally laid to rest, were 7 now, wild as prairie wolves and twice as clever. The cabin had expanded over the years, room added to room as their family grew and their needs changed. What had begun as Tahoma's simple dugout now sprawled across the hillside, a main house with real glass windows, a separate kitchen building to keep the heat out during summer, a barn that housed 6 horses and 2 milk cows, and a chicken coop that produced more eggs than they could eat. The land that had seemed so empty and threatening that first day now felt like an extension of Alice's own body, known and loved in all its moods and seasons. But the world beyond their homestead had changed far more dramatically. The year was 1886, and the old ways Tahoma had spoken of were dying faster than anyone had anticipated. The great buffalo herds were gone, slaughtered nearly to extinction. The reservations had swelled with displaced tribes, their populations decimated by disease and despair. Even Tahoma's cousins had been forced onto the reservation 2 years ago, when soldiers had swept through the territory, rounding up any remaining free bands. Alice heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Tahoma approaching, his hair now streaked with grey at the temples, his face more lined than when they'd met. But his eyes still held that same steady intelligence, that same quiet strength that had first compelled her to trust him when trust seemed impossible. "The children are getting too confident around the water," he said, though his tone was mild. "Hope thinks she can watch them both at once, but the twins are too quick for even her." "They're your children," Alice said with a smile. "Of course they're too quick. I'll go down in a moment." But before she could move, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge, moving fast. They both tensed instinctively. Unexpected visitors rarely brought good news these days. As the rider drew closer, Alice recognized the uniform. A cavalry soldier from Fort Laramie. The young soldier, barely 20, dismounted when he reached them, his face flushed from the hard ride. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackhorse?" he asked, though he clearly knew who they were. "Yes," Tahoma said, his body language wary. "What brings you here?" "Message from Sheriff Daniels, sir. There's trouble in town. The Caldwell Ranch was raided 3 days ago. Vernon Caldwell is dead. Mrs. Caldwell and her daughter are demanding justice, claiming it was Indians from the reservation. The territorial governor has ordered a militia response." Alice felt her stomach drop. "Raided by whom?" "That's the question, ma'am," the soldier said, his young face troubled. "Mrs. Caldwell swears it was reservation Indians, but the tracks don't match. And some of the stolen items have turned up in places that don't make sense. Sheriff Daniels thinks it might have been white men trying to start trouble, maybe hoping to get the government to open up more reservation land for settlement." "Why are you telling us this?" Tahoma asked, his voice carefully neutral. The soldier shifted uncomfortably. "Because Mrs. Caldwell has made accusations, sir. She claims your family might have been involved, seeking revenge for what happened to Mrs. Blackhorse 10 years ago. It's nonsense, everyone knows it. But she's got the governor's ear, and she's demanding an investigation. Sheriff Daniels sent me to warn you that federal marshals might be coming out here to ask questions. He wanted you to be prepared, said you should come to town and make a statement, show yourselves to be cooperative." Rage flooded through Alice, hot and fierce. After all these years, after building a life and a family, after proving herself 100 times over, Abigail Caldwell was still trying to destroy her. "That's absurd," she said, her voice shaking. "We've had no contact with the Caldwells since the day I arrived. We've built our lives here, raised our children, caused no trouble." "I know that, ma'am," the soldier said. "Most people in Fort Laramie know it too. But Mrs. Caldwell is a wealthy widow now, and she's using her influence. Sheriff Daniels wanted you to be prepared." After the soldier left, Alice called the children up from the river. Hope came first, her long dark braids swinging, her face so much like Tahoma's it sometimes took Alice's breath away. The twins followed, Sam with his mother's light hair and his father's dark eyes, Sarah the inverse with dark hair and startlingly blue eyes. "We're going to Fort Laramie tomorrow," Alice announced, keeping her voice calm despite the turmoil in her chest. "All of us together. There's been some trouble, and we need to show that our family had nothing to do with it." "What kind of trouble?" Hope asked immediately, her sharp mind already working through implications. "The kind where people look for someone to blame instead of seeking the truth," Tahoma said. "We'll go, we'll answer their questions, and we'll come home. But you all need to understand something. There will be people who look at us and see only our differences, who see your mother as a traitor to her race and me as a savage, who see you children as mistakes. Tomorrow, you'll see how some people look at families like ours." That night, Alice lay awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling beams Tahoma had hewn from cottonwood trees 8 years ago. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived in this territory, desperate, humiliated, convinced her life was over. And she thought about Abigail Caldwell, nursing her hatred for a decade, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The journey to Fort Laramie took most of the next day. They traveled in their larger wagon, the one Tahoma had built himself 3 years ago. The children were unusually quiet, picking up on their parents' tension. Even the twins, normally chattering constantly, sat subdued. Fort Laramie had grown substantially in 10 years. New buildings lined streets that had been widened and graded. There was a proper hotel now, and a bank and a church with a real bell tower. They drew stairs as they rolled into town, more than usual. Alice held her head high, one hand on Tahoma's arm, the other resting on Hope's shoulder. Let them look, she thought. Let them see a family that refused to be ashamed of itself. Sheriff Daniels met them outside his office, his weathered face creased with concern. "Thank you for coming. The federal marshal arrived this morning. He's eager to close this case quickly, but Mrs. Caldwell is in town too, and she's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're responsible." Before he could say more, a commotion erupted down the street. A crowd had gathered outside the hotel, and at its center stood Abigail Caldwell, older but no less imposing, dressed in expensive black mourning clothes. Beside her stood Constance, who'd grown harder over the years. "There!" Abigail's voice rang out, sharp and accusing. "There's the savage who murdered my son. There's the woman who consorted with Indians and brought this curse upon us." The crowd's mood shifted, became dangerous. Alice felt Tahoma tense beside her, saw him calculating distances, exits, threats. She pulled the children closer, her heart hammering, but then another voice cut through the noise, strong and clear. "That's quite enough, Abigail." Sarah Henderson emerged from the general store, older and rounder but still formidable. Behind her came Doc Morrison and the preacher and several other townspeople. They positioned themselves between the Black Horse family and the angry crowd. "The Black Horses had nothing to do with the raid on your ranch," Mrs. Henderson declared. "They were here in town that very day, buying supplies from my store. I have the records to prove it. Half the town saw them. She's lying to protect them." Constance shrieked, "Are you calling me a liar, girl?" Mrs. Henderson's voice could have cut steel. "I've lived in this territory for 30 years. I've never once been caught in a falsehood. Can you say the same?" Alice stepped forward despite Tahoma's restraining hand. "Why would we want revenge after 10 years? We've built a good life. We have children to protect. What possible reason would we have to jeopardize all of that for revenge against a man who was nothing to me but a coward?" The crowd murmured, some nodding. Alice pressed her advantage, her voice rising. "You rejected me, Mrs. Caldwell. You called me too old, too worn, unfit to bear sons. You humiliated me in front of this entire town. And you know what? You did me a favor, because that rejection led me to a man who values me, to a life I chose instead of one I settled for, to children I'm proud of." She gestured to her family. "Look at them. Look at my children. They're healthy, educated, loved. They know 2 languages, 2 cultures. They can survive in wilderness or civilization. What do your people have? A dead son who never stood up to you. A daughter who married for status and ended up miserable. And you, alone in your grand house, so consumed by bitterness that you can't rest until you've destroyed anyone who dared to thrive after you rejected them." The federal marshal, who'd been watching from the sheriff's office doorway, stepped forward. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you have any actual evidence linking the Black Horse family to the raid on your property, beyond your personal grievances?" Before Abigail could formulate a response, a young cavalry officer pushed through the crowd. "Marshal, sir, I have information relevant to this case. We caught 2 men trying to sell stolen goods from the Caldwell Ranch in Deadwood 3 days ago. Both white men, known criminals with records of theft and violence. They've confessed to the raid, said they picked the Caldwell Ranch specifically because it was isolated, and they knew Mrs. Caldwell kept cash in the house." The revelation rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Abigail's face went from purple to white. Constance grabbed her mother's arm. The marshal turned to Alice and Tahoma. "It appears you've been falsely accused. You have my apologies. This matter is closed as far as you're concerned." The crowd began to disperse. Mrs. Henderson approached Alice and squeezed her hand briefly. "Well said, dear. About time someone told that woman the truth about herself." But Abigail wasn't finished. She broke away from Constance and advanced on Alice, her face twisted with a decade of accumulated venom. "You think you've won? You think you're better than me because you've made a life with a savage and produced mongrel children? You're a disgrace to your race, to everything decent people stand for." Alice looked at the woman who had once held the power to destroy her and felt only pity. "I don't think I'm better than you, Mrs. Caldwell. I just think I'm happier. And that must be unbearable for you to witness." She turned away, gathering her children, taking Tahoma's hand. They walked back to their wagon with heads high. Behind them, Abigail Caldwell stood alone in the dusty street, her hatred burning itself out with nothing left to fuel it. The ride home was quiet for the first hour. Then Sam spoke up from the back. "Mother, why did that lady hate us so much? We never did anything to her." Alice considered how to answer. "Some people build their sense of worth by tearing others down. They need to believe they're better than certain other people. And when those people thrive despite their judgment, it threatens the story they've told themselves about the world." "That's stupid," Sarah declared bluntly. "Yes," Tahoma agreed. "It is, but it's also dangerous. You saw today how quickly a crowd can turn, how accusations alone can threaten innocent people. This is why we must always be careful, always be above reproach. We exist in a space between worlds. We have fewer protections and more people watching for us to fail." They crested the hill that overlooked their homestead just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The cabin they'd built together stood solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney. The horses in the corral whinnied in greeting. Matteau, now grey-muzzled and arthritic, emerged from the barn and barked his rusty welcome. This was home. Not because it was easy or because the world accepted it, but because they had claimed it, built it, defended it with their choices and their courage. That night, after the children had been fed and settled and the animals tended, Alice and Tahoma sat on the porch they'd built 5 years ago, watching the stars emerge. The spirit road blazed overhead, unchanged by human drama. "Do you ever regret it?" Alice asked softly. "Taking in a desperate white woman who had nowhere else to go. Marrying someone who brought you nothing but complications." Tahoma was quiet for a long moment. "I regret many things in my life. I regret the treaties my people signed, trusting in words that meant nothing. I regret the friends and family lost to disease and despair. I regret that our children will grow up in a world where the old ways are dying and the new ways don't want them." He took her hand, calloused palm against calloused palm. "But I've never regretted you. You brought me back to life when I had accepted that I would die alone. You gave me children who carry both our bloods, both our stories. You chose this life when you could have chosen safety. How could I regret that?" Alice leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I was thinking today about the woman I was when I arrived here. So afraid, so broken, so certain my life was over. If I could go back and tell her what was coming, all the challenges and struggles and judgment—" "Would you?" Tahoma asked. "Would you warn her away?" "No," Alice said with certainty. "Because she needed to walk this path to become who she is now. She needed to be rejected and humiliated. She needed to fall so you could catch her. She needed to learn that the life she thought she wanted wasn't the life she needed." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of broken expectations and built something real from the ruins. Inside the cabin, their children slept peacefully. 3 lives that existed because 2 people had chosen courage over convention. The prairie wind whispered its eternal song, carrying with it the scent of sage and grass. In the distance, a coyote howled, answered by another from across the valley. The river murmured its endless journey toward distant oceans. And on a porch built by their own hands, in a life they'd chosen against all advice and opposition, Alice Winter's black horse sat with her husband under the stars and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She'd been thrown from a wagon, discarded as too old and worthless. But in falling she'd been caught. And in being caught, she'd found not just refuge but purpose. Not just survival, but joy. Not just a place to exist, but a reason to thrive. The world would continue to change. The struggles would continue. Their children would face challenges Alice and Tahoma couldn't fully protect them from. But they would face them as a family, united by choice and strengthened by love that had been earned through shared hardship. "We should go in," Tahoma said finally. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "Tomorrow is always another long day," Alice replied with a smile. "But that's all right. We'll face it together, like we faced everything else." They rose and went inside, closing the door against the night. The stars continued their watch overhead. The prairie continued its ancient cycles, and in a small cabin by a river in the Dakota Territory, a family that shouldn't exist by any conventional measure proved that sometimes the best lives are forged in the fires of rejection, built on the foundations of resilience and sustained by the quiet courage of choosing love over fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.